Good morning. Good morning from Bonn. Good afternoon, wherever you might be in the world. And welcome to the press briefing for the Interconnected Disaster Risks Report 2023. The Interconnected Disaster Risks Report is a report that is published annually by United Nations Universities Institute for Environment and Human Security. This year marks the third edition of the report, and the report this year focuses on risk tipping points. My name is Nadine Hoffman. I am the head of communications of UNU-EHS, which is the abbreviation for United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. And I'm joined here by two of the experts and lead authors of the report. Dr. Zita Shebeshwari, she is the deputy director of UNU-EHS, and Dr. Jack O'Connor, who is also a lead author and a senior expert at United Nations University. Thank you so much for joining. Before Zita and Jack will start out with their opening statements, I would like to explain to you how you can ask questions in this press briefing. If you look at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom webinar, there is the Q&A function, and this is what we're going to be using to be asking questions. At any time during the press briefing, we would welcome you to write your questions into the Q&A function down there. And we would ask that you add your name and the name of the outlet that you are representing. Please do note that this is a press briefing and it's primarily intended for journalists. So if you are joining from an NGO or any other type of organization, we would be happy to take your questions too, but we would ask that you leave this webinar for the journalists and email your questions to press@ehs.unu.edu, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thanks so much. I will now give the floor to Dr. Jack O'Connor to start talking about this year's report.
Thank you very much, Nadine, and good morning. And it's my pleasure to talk to everybody joining us today. And I just wanted to start with a quick question. Picture yourself in a car driving down a road, and you look out the window and you see signs by the side of the road saying that ahead the road is out and you're heading towards a cliff. Now, as you're speeding along this road, the signs are clearly saying that the cliff is getting closer and closer, and you need to turn around now to avoid catastrophe. What would you do? Today, as we launch the Interconnected Disaster Risks Report for the third time, this year we focus on the theme of risk tipping points. Now, in contrast to some other tipping points that you may know about, risk tipping points focus on the natural and man-made systems that we rely on every day for our basic needs, such as food, water, health, security, and so on. And these systems that we rely on, we also focus on the human element. And in other words, how we are driving risk in these systems to the point where they may at some point collapse. And what are the new risks that come after we pass this kind of threshold? If we can think of the systems as towers of wooden blocks, like in Jenga, and we and our behaviors are slowly removing pieces one by one from the base until at some point the system can no longer cope with the growing instability and it collapses. In our report, we have 6 of these risk tipping points, and they're titled Accelerating Extinctions, Groundwater Depletion, Melting Mountain Glaciers, Space Debris, Unbearable Heat, and Uninsurable Future. And if we see ourselves in the driver's seat of these systems as we speed towards these risk tipping points, what we see is that often not only are we failing to slow the car down, but often we're pressing our foot down further on the accelerator. In the case of groundwater depletion, for example, this case relates to our dwindling supply of our freshwater resources located underground. Groundwater supplies up to half of our global drinking water supply and supports 40% of our global agriculture. However, the major groundwater sources around the world are currently being depleted through our unsustainable use much faster than we can or they can be naturally replenished. And this is pushing us towards a tipping point beyond which we will no longer be able to access this valuable resource. And this is already happening in places around the world, like Saudi Arabia, the United States, and India, where farmers are already having to switch to riskier forms of watering their crops or to importing food from other areas. Now, if we look at groundwater and also the other systems in the report as valuable safety nets that we need in the face of climate change. For example, groundwater can reduce agricultural losses due to drought globally by around half. Then as we pass risk tipping points, we risk losing these valuable safety nets one by one. On this point, the report also shows that risk tipping points are not isolated cases. They're also interconnected. So passing a risk tipping point in one system can have cascading impacts that can put risk up in other systems. If we look at the case of space debris, in this case, it has to do with our practice of putting satellites up into our orbit without regard for handling the debris that comes as a result. At present, we're tracking around 34,000 objects in our orbit. Only around a quarter of these are active satellites, and we're planning thousands more launches in the coming years. And so we may reach a point where it gets so crowded in our orbit that one collision can create enough debris to set off a chain reaction of further collisions that could destroy our space infrastructure entirely. Now, we use satellites every day to monitor our world. For example, we can observe weather patterns that can give us data that can generate early warnings for oncoming disasters. And we take these warnings sometimes for granted, but can we imagine if we pass this space debris risk tipping point and we're no longer able to observe weather patterns? Now a storm is coming to a populated area and we can't see it coming. Satellites can also monitor other useful things, such as our groundwater levels. So if we pass the space debris tipping point and we're no longer able to monitor our groundwater from space, now the risk of groundwater depletion also goes up. Another way in which the risk tipping points are interconnected are through what we call root causes. So in the report, we look at what's behind these risk tipping points, and what we see is it comes back often to our values and behaviors that are driving risky actions across different systems. For both space debris and groundwater depletion, some of the risk tipping point root causes that they share include insufficient risk management and prioritizing profits. And these root causes relate to our inability to properly perceive and plan for future risks, but also our extractive attitudes towards shared resources and places that results in prioritizing short-term gains for some at the cost of long-term benefits for all. Now, our report is not saying that we are doomed to cross these risk tipping points, but rather it's supposed to empower us to see the paths that we have ahead of us and to take steps towards a better future. We are still driving the car, and we still have a choice.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jack O'Connor. I will now give the floor to Dr. Zita Shebeshwari to talk about the solutions and what we might be able to do about the risk tipping points.
Thank you very much, Nadine. So listening to all these risk tipping points sounds very sobering. It feels like juggling with many challenges at the same time, and we really don't want to let them drop any of them. So we really need to pay attention to all of them. One opportunity we have is to actually turn this interconnectivity to our advantage. So many of these tipping points share certain root causes and drivers. Jack already mentioned some of them. I would like to highlight one, which is climate change, which is cutting across at least 4 out of the 6 risk tipping points. So decisive action, climate action, and cutting our emissions can help to slow down or even prevent some of the impacts on accelerating extinction, unbearable heat, uninsurable future, and also mounting glaciers melting. So that is a chance we can take to look at the shared root causes and drivers and tackle them to have an impact across different tipping points. The report also brings along a new framework which we developed in the course of the last year, which helps us, but also decision makers across all levels to sort different response options with regard to the expected outcome, what that kind of action might bring as an outcome, so to say. So They are fundamentally two different actions we see. One we categorize as so-called avoid actions, and the other one we call adapt actions. So avoid actions aim to steer us away from the tipping point so that we do not actually cross the point, and we take actions to prevent us getting there. Whereas adapt action we can take in anticipation of us crossing possibly the tipping point, or once the tipping point is already crossed. So first, I would like to turn to the avoid type of measures, and using the groundwater example, which was already provided. So if we would want to avoid depleting our groundwater, we need to get to a balance in our groundwater levels, or infiltration balancing with our extraction. So we can increase infiltration by, for example, removing sealing of surfaces, for example, in urban areas. We can restore wetlands or rivers so that altogether more water can infiltrate and can replenish our groundwater. Probably even more importantly, we have to look into our groundwater use for what are we extracting groundwater, how much, and what are the trade-offs, and how we could manage it more wisely to keeping it in a sustainable level for the long run. Turning to the adapt type of examples, and some places of the world, the tipping point for groundwater extraction is already crossed. So what can we do at that situation? We can revert to different kind of water sources. We can harvest rainwater. We can use wastewater for irrigation, of course, treated wastewater, or also we can rethink our agriculture in a way that we conserve soil moisture and altogether less water-intense crops, which we are using then in agriculture. If we are thinking about space, that's a bit harder if we are thinking about adaptation, because what can we do if we actually lose our space infrastructure? So we would kind of be sent back to the mid-20th century, where we did not have space infrastructure for Earth monitoring, where we did not receive early warning from space, and we would need to strengthen our Earth-based infrastructure basically to overcome it. But of course, this would come with constraints. So within both categories, avoid and adapt, there are again two types of actions. One we call delay action, and another transform. So delay actions would be those, coming back to Jack's analogy with the car. So if we actually take our feet from the accelerator and slow down, those are the delay actions which can give us a little bit more time. Like in relation to the space junk tipping point, we can apply more advanced technology to prevent collisions in space. That would be an avoid action, because we are not tackling the root cause. We are not lowering the number of satellites, but we are more intelligently maneuvering, so to say, our existing satellites. And avoid a delay action would be also to cover our glaciers with a reflective blanket. So we can already see that this will not prevent glacier melting, but may give us a little bit more time. But the report emphasized that the real actions we have to look into are the so-called transform actions. And getting back to the car analogy, this would actually mean to get out from the car and question, why are we speeding towards that dangerous cliff? Are there probably other choices and other priorities we could set, which could take us to a completely different pathway? So if we are thinking about the space again, just to continue with the example, we would need to rethink how we use space, acknowledging that this is a common poor resource where everyone should have access, and we should save it for the benefit of future generations. And this boils down to very high choices we have to make, recognizing that we have to safeguard the rights and the options of future generations, for example. And this is what we called in the report being a good ancestor. And what does it mean in praxis is to build in our decision making and in our choices very firmly and structurally the rights and options of future generations. There are some good examples out there, but by far not enough. And what the report concludes with that we're mainly seeing delay type of actions currently undertaken, and clearly not enough to actually steer away society from those dangerous tipping points. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zita Shebeshwari. We are now going to turn to the question and answer part of this press briefing. So if you haven't yet, please feel free to put your questions in the question and answer function of the webinar. Please do remember to add your name and the name of your outlet when you do so. And to give you a little bit of time to write your questions, I'm going to start out by asking the first question, and then we'll turn over to your questions. My first question for the two of you would be, you are releasing this report very shortly before COP28 is about to start. Do you see it relating to COP28, and what would be your message to decision makers if so? Jack, would you like to say?
Thank you. Yes, I think that the report is very connected with the COP process and absolutely climate change. As Zita was saying, if we look at the risk tipping points, our actions of continuing our emissions and driving climate change is connected to driving up risk in so many different areas. So addressing this important problem will logically reduce our risk in many different areas, and this is something we need to keep in mind. But also, I think that we need to keep in mind that as things are interconnected, this is the main message of the report. The climate system is one driver of risk, but there are also others, and that we need to start thinking about these as interconnected. So reducing our emissions is key, but we also need to integrate this with addressing other contributing factors such as biodiversity loss globally and other forms of pollution. And in this way, we can make more effective change.
Thanks so much. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I would probably highlight our risk tipping point, which is called unbearable heat, which relates to a certain threshold, which is already has been crossed some parts of the Earth, which really demonstrate a physiological limit to the human body to regulate heat. What we are seeing across the globe that more and more air conditioning facilities are installed as a response to more and more heat waves. And this is very understandable from the individual perspective, and also from the perspective of protecting vulnerable population. Now the worry is that basically with more and more cooling capacity installed, the share of cooling related emissions will only increase, and this is a concern. And I would like to highlight that there is a global cooling pledge which will be placed at COP28. This is led by the UN Environmental Programme and COP presidency to gather countries to voluntarily commit to reduce emissions related to cooling capacity. This is very important and ties in very closely with our messages in this report.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to ask a question from one of the journalists. We received a question from Svenja Bella, Der Freitag. And the question is, how did you define those 6 tipping points? And how do they differ from other models, such as the 9 planetary boundaries? Who would like to take this question? Jack? Yes.
Sure. So as I mentioned in the statement, defining these risk tipping points, people have heard this term before. But really, we're looking at specifically systems that are being used by us every day and the human element driving risk. And what we were looking to define in these systems is a threshold where the system changes a certain function that we rely on it for. So for example, for groundwater depletion, we were looking at the risk tipping point whereby the water is no longer within reach of the wells that we use as infrastructure to access that water for irrigation. So and past that point, the irrigation system ceases to function and affects food production. And this is the kind of thinking we had across the different cases. In terms of the 9 planetary boundaries, in a way, it's a similar type of thinking. We're setting these points and we're saying we need to avoid crossing these points. But while the planetary boundaries set very broad limits to cross to do with nutrients and biodiversity, our risk tipping points can really be applied more at the local level. So groundwater can deplete in a well next to your house. A species can go extinct in your area or other areas also. So I think that we similar to the planetary boundaries concept, but perhaps we're pulling on a few threads that the planetary boundary concept does not pull on.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe just to add that our background is we are coming from an institute looking at disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation transformation. So those are our topics. And when we are looking at the 6 tipping points, basically we are emphasizing that we are about to lose certain very key risk reduction tools which we used to rely on in the past. And this is cross-cutting. So this is also why we are calling this risk tipping point, because at that point when we are losing them, our ability to manage the risk changes suddenly and rapidly, and often in a way that it's not reversible, or at least not in a short time frame. So that's another unique perspective of our risk tipping point concept.
Thanks so much. The next question is from Moos Appelblad from the Brussels Times. And the question is this report more related to climate change than the previous one? Zita, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I can say that climate change is a strong driver also in the tipping points. And in the previous reports, we have seen climate change driving us towards those disasters. But what common is that it's not only climate change, and we honing into this systemic risk notion that climate change comes together with other type of risks, and altogether causes this this web of risk, which we only can address if we see this more holistically. So if we only address climate change, then we are missing out, for example, on space debris, and we might lose a tool which can be very helpful to actually help us to address climate change, help us to monitor the impacts of climate change, and help us also in monitoring, for example, adaptation success.
Would you like to add something?
Sure. I very much agree with what Zita was saying, and same with the previous reports looking at disasters specifically, and the tipping points here, we see climate change as a cause all throughout. But in this report, we're also looking forward past the tipping points towards the future risks. And what we see is that if we have climate change factoring in there also, it really makes the future risks even worse.
Thank you. I see Moos has a follow-up question, and that is, did you measure how close we are to the tipping points and when they will be reached?
Well, the tipping points were more of a conceptual point to communicate the risk in a system that we use in different ways depending on where we are. So as we mentioned, actually, each of these tipping points, we can point to cases where it has already tipped somewhere in the world. And in other places, it may be just below the threshold, and in other places it may be a little bit further. So this makes it the variety in where different places are on this timeline of the risk tipping point is quite diverse. So we didn't attempt to come up with a cumulative measure because it wouldn't be so representative. But suffice to say that the risk is great enough that definitely the risk tipping points that we've selected, we're pointing to the need for action right now.
Maybe just to add that this is a kind of a pattern what we are seeing, that the risk tipping points are crossed globally at different places at different times, which also offers us an opportunity to learn from each other and help each other, so to say. So if in a country groundwater wasn't used in the past for irrigation, and the country rather relied, or a region rather relied on rain-fed agriculture, but rain pattern is becoming more unreliable with climate change, and it's not enough for agriculture anymore. This is a point of time where farmers might turn to groundwater in a much greater, with a much greater emphasis, so to say. That's a very good point of time to think about how we actually want to manage groundwater resources. Our groundwater management plans sophisticated enough for this new pressure and new need? Are the control mechanisms in place so that instead of running into this tipping point and into this challenge, take that time to actually think this through? And this is a learning opportunity, but also a support opportunity. So if some regions are already there, usually then they are starting to import crops, for example, from somewhere else. So it's important at that point that it's not just the same attitude is taken to another place, and we continue to extract groundwater to the detriment of future opportunities and future generations.
Thank you. I see we also received a question on social media, and that question is, are these tipping points interconnected too? For example, are space debris and groundwater depletion interconnected? Would you like to?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
We did touch on this a little in the statement, but yes, one of the main messages is these tipping points are not occurring in isolation, but they in a way can feed each other when they tip. So we did talk about space debris and groundwater. Space debris is actually one that we don't think about much, but we use it for many different things, including keeping track of our groundwater levels. So once we lose that ability, we lose the ability to monitor groundwater, and the risk goes up there. But I guess I'll take this opportunity to mention some cases that haven't been so strongly mentioned so far already today. For example, unbearable heat. This case, we focus really on the threshold for human beings. For us, what is the heat that we can take before we start seeing serious health issues? But this heat, of course, also relates to nature. Ecosystems and animals are also feeling this heat. They also have thresholds, and as the temperature rises, they will be forced into dire situations. So unbearable heat tipping can also increase the risk of accelerating extinctions. And to take it even further, when accelerating extinctions lead to ecosystem degradation, often ecosystems we rely on for as natural protection against things like disasters. So if we start to see ecosystems declining, now we have less protection, which means disasters can become more damaging, and then it would raise the risk of uninsurability.
Anything to add?
Maybe just to add one particular point which was new to me when we started with research. So also satellites are insured. So basically with the rising risk of collisions, there's also a risk of uninsurability in space. So there are everywhere connections, and some of them are rather unseen and unexpected, but can have huge impacts. Another maybe interesting fact that in many places of the earth where there's fire risk is high, managed fire or prescribed fire is used to reduce wildfire risk. So everyone who is engaged in such activities need to take out insurance, because otherwise, in case something goes wrong, the individual risk would be far too high. However, insurers started to leave that market because of the rising risk. So what is the consequence of that? If someone who want to actively manage fire risk and want to use prescribed burning are not getting insurance anymore, this will mean that the risk for wildfires increases with much more damages, and also kind of cascading impacts on the housing insurance market. So that those are just few of the examples where we see connections, and where we think that reaching one tipping point can impact another one.
Thanks so much. I see another question here from the Brussels Times, and it's a very interconnected question, I would say. The question is, but will heavy rains and floods because of climate change also help to restore groundwater? So can it also work the other way around, I suppose? Who would like to take this question?
Yes, this is an interesting point, and we will see heavier rains and floods in certain areas due to climate change. But I think it's important to point out that these effects in the future are difficult to predict, and they are not uniform around the world. So some areas may receive increases in heavy rains and floods, and this may help to recharge groundwater resources. However, other areas will not. And I think that we should not gamble with where we may get recharge and where we may not, but rather take the precautionary approach of changing our behaviors now to reduce our risk, just in case we aren't saved later by climate change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you want to add something, Zita?
Yeah, maybe just at the point that it's heavy rain after causing a lot of erosion, and also depending on the weather conditions before the heavy rain event, it may or may not lead to a high amount of infiltration. So basically changing land use in a way that flooding and heavy rain can be, so to say, taken up, that there's buffer capacity. Wetlands are very good in that. We have been discussing in Europe for a while also sponge cities, and they are also implemented, for example, in China, so that altogether increase the capacity of the amount of water which an area can handle and buffer, because once we manage to keep the water in place, then it can also infiltrate. If there's sealed surfaces, for example, then nothing infiltrates, but rather we are overwhelming our stormwater infrastructure, and we are not getting a gain of increased infiltration.
Thank you. I see there's some interest in space. There's a question whether there are too many small satellites in space, and if we're sending up too many satellites at the moment. Zita is nodding, so I think Zita might want to take this question.
Yeah, I wouldn't point to any particular size of satellites. The concern is that the number of satellites we are launching increasing heavily. So last year it was 2,400, but we started out just a few years ago with much smaller numbers annually. So it's heavily increasing, and looking into the number of satellites which are currently in the permission process. So we're, so to say, already permission has been filed. We are looking into roughly an amount of 100,000 satellites which might be placed in the orbit by 2030. And this is just a number which is already, so to say, in the permission process. So this is why we think this is very important point of time to talk about this challenge, because we are kind of in a curve, and we will feel the impacts of what we are doing today in the future. So that by increasing the number of objects in space, increasing also the risk of collisions.
Thank you. We have another question here. How does this report simplify short-term recovery and long-term resilience pathways to the planetary crisis? Would you like to take this one, Jack?
Sure. Very nice question. And it relates a little bit to the framework that Zita was talking about that we come in with in this report. So short-term recovery, this is something that can be used to make an area resilient, as we say, in the short term. And I think these kinds of situations relate to things that are more tangible, things that we already have in mind for various types of recovery efforts. But the long-term resilience that we point to is sort of looking to build these short-term recoveries with a more forward-looking lens. And really the only way that we can do that is to look at our values and maybe reflect on these and change these to think about doing things a little bit differently. So for example, if we see an ecosystem is very heavily degraded due to a disaster or due to other means, and we might think, okay, we'll set up a restoration, we can replant trees. If it's a forest, for example, we have tools that we can use. But perhaps what we're not doing is thinking about what the drivers were behind this ecosystem getting degraded in the first place. What were the pressures? What were the things that we wanted to extract from this ecosystem? And if we then start to think about how we value nature, and maybe we make it more prominently important than we did before, then things like restoration can have a better chance of being more effective.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah, maybe there's one risk tipping point we haven't talked about yet, and there's actually very much responding to this question, which is the melting of mountain glaciers. So when basically due to global warming, glaciers are warming faster than they used to, they are melting faster than they used to melt in the past. At first, we're actually getting more water downstream because of the melting. So communities are dealing with, for example, glacier lake outburst floods, which means that the meltwater accumulates in a lake, which might not be able to keep that amount of water and might burst, causing flash flood downstream and huge damages. So what is our concern that once a lot of melting happened, basically they reach a so-called peak water. This is what we take as tipping point in this case. So at that point of time, it's basically shifts from downstream having too much water to getting a water scarce situation because the glacier is retreating and getting lost. So short-term versus long-term would mean that already now, when we're still experiencing actually flooding and flood risk, we need to think about that this will turn on the long run into water scarcity, and that we are planning ahead already now.
Thank you. We have another question from Svenja Beller from Der Freitag. Do you see other tipping points on the horizon apart from these 6 ones? Zita is nodding.
Yeah, we do. So when we prepared, so to say, this report, we're looking much broader, and the only thing is that we decided, so to say, to do the in-depth research for these 6. So we would restrain listing further tipping points because we haven't done the the hardcore research behind them. So today we are launching the report, and it comes with a main report, but you will find on the website also 6 technical reports which describe in a very detailed way, based on scientific findings, substantiate these risk tipping points, their impacts, and how to deal with them. So they are more, but since we haven't focusing on them in terms of research, we would restrain to name others at this point.
Thank you. I see we are approaching the 45-minute mark, and we were trying to keep our press briefing around 45 minutes. So I'm going to ask a last question, and that is perhaps a bit more personal. Which one of the tipping points worries you the most personally? Do you want to start, Jack?
Sure. Yeah, good question. We try not to differentiate between the severity of these tipping points. I think this gets around this a little. To be honest, the one that worries me most personally, I would say, is accelerating extinctions. In this, we already know we have a biodiversity crisis, but recent research has shown that the way that ecological networks are formed means that as we lose biodiversity, we increase the risk of this chain reaction of extinctions in an ecosystem. And so that extinctions could accelerate at a much faster rate in the future. That one worries me the most personally, although I would say I think every time we talk about space debris and what can happen up there, that's also quite scary.
Thank you. Sita?
Yeah, I would probably highlight space debris, because I think this is the one where individuals probably have the least agency how to change that pattern. So communities and individuals can influence the other risk tipping points much stronger. And if it comes to space debris, it's really more about bringing this into light, talking about demand change. But my personal individual influence is probably the least. And that makes me worried, so to say, because I think me, as many others, we just love to have agency and love to have it at least partially in our hand. So I would guess my contribution to this risk tipping point is to talk about it and raise awareness for it.
Thanks so much. Now that we've closed the questions, I do want to give Zita and Jack one last chance to see if they would have any closing statements, any final thoughts on this that they would like to leave us with. Would you like to start?
Sure. Actually, from this press briefing today and looking at the questions and listening to what's being said, I think that my main final takeaway is that these tipping points are either past, about to happen, maybe depending on where you are in the world, you have a little bit more time. But you should be looking at what's happening in other places of the world, because we're all interconnected, and the impacts of tipping points passing in other places will eventually affect you. But also, if you have the luxury of time to act now, you should learn the lesson and take it.
Thanks. Sita?
Maybe I would like to use the chance to highlight that across the 5 changes we highlight in the report, which we need to make, we have mainly talked about the one which is called being a good ancestor. So taking more responsibility for the rights and opportunities of future generations. But the report covers some very important others, such as zero waste, so that we see all resources as precious and work in a circular way with those resources, but also to think about what guide us, what we see as a goal. So is it really increase of GDP? Is it really economic development? Or could we look into an economy of well-being, so to increase well-being for everyone? And maybe I think this is what I would like to close with.
Thank you. Very nice final words. Thank you so much for attending this press briefing, either as part of the webinar or on social media. In case you've been wondering what I've been holding on my lap this whole time, this is what the report looks like. It's now been officially published, and you can find it on the report website, interconnectedrisks.org. And this is also where you can find a lot of the supporting materials, for example, the technical reports that Zita mentioned earlier. So we would encourage you to check out the website. And yes, please let us know how you feel about it. Share it wherever you share on social media, etc. And we thank you so much for attending this press briefing. If you have any final questions for us, if there's anything else we can help you with, please feel free to reach out to press@ehs.unu.edu. Thank you so much, and thank you, Zita and Jack, as well.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.